Alright guys, I've had enough time to play around with Takeru, and I've had enough time to dust off my Muramasa and bring him to some nodes. In fact, I brought both of these servants to the exact same nodes to see how much damage they'd be able to do, how well they would loop, all that good stuff, so I could give you guys my take on which of the two servants I think is better. Now, before we start getting into it, and before anybody can really comment this down, yes, both of the setups for Takeru and Muramasa are different. My friend was using Takeru as I did not pull him. He also has Oberon. I have Waver. I did not get lucky enough to pull Oberon. The only thing that this really would have changed is the actual damage for some of the free quests, but don't worry, I dedicated an entire portion of this video to breaking down the calcs of both of these servants. So if you want true calculations and, getting into how they look in a 3-turn environment when their buffs are expiring or when you're choosing to use their buffs, Muramasa stacking, all of that good stuff will be represented through a calculator that I went ahead and did towards the end of this video. And do not worry, nobody failed to farm a free quest because, I didn't have Oberon or anything. It's just a difference of me not having Oberon and my friend having him. But they both performed very, very well in the exact same free quest. And yes, I brought them to the exact same quest. That's where there's no discrepancies. It's not like, okay, well, maybe Takeru got lucky because he has Divinity Power Mod, or Muramasa was fighting a king, so got that little bit of a kick from his passive. There should be none of that in this video. But before we begin, if you would like these analyses for FGO-related content, make sure you leave in the comments down below, 1, some analysis of some servants that you'd like to see in the comments down below, but 2, make sure you leave a like and subscribe to catch all these videos and more as I upload FGO content every single day. But with that being said, let's go ahead and just start getting into this, and let's talk about some of the results of the free quest farming. Now, this should be no surprise to anybody, but Takeru seems to loop a little bit better. And this really does come down to the fact that Takeru has an 8-hit arts AoE NP, whereas Muramasa is only rocking 3 hits on his NP, and even though he's got about 0.2% more NP gain on him, that 3 versus 8 hit is making a world of a difference when it comes to Takeru and Muramasa when it comes to them being able to loop. If you're a newer player and you don't really know why that is, essentially more hits means you can get more overkill on the enemies. That's when you say kill them by the 3rd hit on your NP, your next hits will gen overkill, which means you're getting more NP refund back than you normally would. And because Takeru has 8 hits, if he takes an enemy out early on into his, like 1st, 2nd, or 3rd hit, he's going to be getting way more NP back, whereas Muramasa doesn't really have the hits to take advantage of that. Maybe he kills them by the 2nd hit, and he's only getting overkill on that 3rd hit, on top of his NP gain not being ridiculously high. And so when it comes to who's going to be better if you just need a guy that can do raw NP gain, you just need them to loop things, you're going to want to go with Takeru. But that does not mean that Muramasa cannot get the job done. Muramasa, it was an art staple for quite a while. There was a lot of people that went for him and used him as their main looper for a reason. The guy can do some very strong damage, which we'll get into in a little bit, but he can also loop well enough, especially with that 50% battery, to get him across the finish line. Although that is another thing that I believe Takeru has over Muramasa and is gonna start to show in 90+ and 90++ content, as Takeru seems to be built a little bit more tailored for the current meta of FGO, where he has a split battery. He still has 50% total, but it's split into his different skills, meaning you'll see in one of the nodes that I have to fire Muramasa's battery when I only have, say, 80% NP, so I don't really need to waste that extra 30%, but Takeru doesn't have to do that because you can use the 20% battery and save the 30% for later, which is a very, very valuable skill to have on which you'll see a lot of current art units. Berserker Castoria is a very good single target looper, and she's got 2 split batteries. She has a 50% and a 20%, and that makes her an absolute killer. When you start getting those split batteries, it makes the world of a difference, especially with your arts and quick farmers, because they're more reliant on looping. For Buster, it doesn't really matter because you're not really looping per se. You're more just refunding your skills and giving raw NP into people. 70% battery from Oberon is going to be good. Go figure. But I do think these are 2 areas that Takeru is beating out Muramasa. The split battery is going to age very, very well because instead of having to waste the entire battery when you don't really need to early on, is going to be very valuable. And then also having higher NP gain just means he's going to be more conducive to taking out that 90+ and 90++ content where the nodes might be a little bit weird. But again, don't fret. If you have Muramasa or you just prefer Muramasa to Takeru, I'm a bit of a Takeru enjoyer myself, but I also like Muramasa playing the UBW remix. Every time I fire the NP, it gets me gassed. You're still going to be able to get the job done with Muramasa is what I'm saying, because as you can see, even though some of his looping isn't the prettiest, sometimes only looping, 60% back, it's still enough to get the job done. And I was even very impressed. You'll see later when I'm farming against these two large Moors enemies, I was very concerned if I had to pop the first skill if to just get more than 50% back so Waver would be able to push him over the edge to loop the third node. But no, even against two Avenger enemies, he was able to get 52% back. Just enough, but sometimes just enough is what you need, because as long as you can do it, you're able to loop those stages. So it's not like you got to get Takeru because you're not going to be able to use Muramasa. It just might not be as pretty with Muramasa, especially because, like how I was mentioning earlier, Takeru seems to be built a bit more for the current meta, as Muramasa does have that King power mod on his passive skills down there. It's only 20%, but King is not a bad power mod for him to have. Unfortunately, Lancer, King type enemies aren't, I would say, the most, common guys to be running into. Your people like your Skahawks or, your Lancer Artorias. It just doesn't feel like you get as much as if, say, it was a Saber King, right? Like, it feels like you're getting more out of stuff like that, or your Gilgameshes that tend to appear a little bit more. And especially not when compared to the two power mods that Takeru has against Divine and Demonic enemies, which cover a lot of free quest enemies and a lot of servants as well. Which does make it seem like Takeru's going to be the better looper, right? He has the higher hits, they have relatively similar NP gain. The split battery is a very nice bit of tech that he's able to use, and then having two power mods that are very, very strong seems like he's going to be the better choice. And 90% of the time I would agree with you, but I do think there are some moments where Muramasa is going to outshine Takeru, but we gotta start talking about how their damage actually works between the two of them, because Takeru loses his NP damage buff on wave 1, and Muramasa is a unit that builds up as the fight goes on. But now we have to get into some real goofy stuff, and that is going to be their actual NP damage. And I know I'm showing the NP damage chart, but don't worry, I have individual counts for both of these servants because I want to show and make it very clear for, say, the average player who doesn't really get into doing the counts in a very easy way why both of these are actually kind of wrong for both Takeru and Muramasa. See, for Muramasa right now, it's not entirely wrong, but this is a turn 1 Muramasa with his skill 1 buff and doesn't take into account his buildup. And for Takeru over here, this is him with the card debuff down and the NP damage buff, which again is only a 1 turn buff, and so it's a little disingenuous. You look at this and you would think, oh, well, Takeru is way better than Muramasa, he's blowing him out of the water. But here's what people just do not consider. They don't consider what these buffs actually mean in a more practical environment when you're bringing these guys to your different free quests. And let me show you what I mean. So we have Takeru over here, and this is showing him on turn 2 or turn 3 when he does not have the NP damage buff. As you can see, it's going to line up very similarly to the original calc over here. You give him his NP damage buff for wave 1, and then bada boom, bada bing, he's hitting 30.3, right? Same as always. But then you got to start considering that after turn 1, you're going to lose this because obviously you're going to use the second skill buff or the third skill buff, my bad. You're going to use this because you want the arts buff over here. You want this so he can loop. And so that means you're going to have to sacrifice this very early on, which I don't really like because it brings his real damage down. And then you also have to consider that if you're fighting, say, a mixed node and say a 90++ situation, those other guys are only getting hit with this. They're not getting hit with very much damage at all because, again, this right here, the card buff only applies to one enemy. You only get to hit one guy with this. That's not, say, a slight against Takeru or anything. It's just something you have to consider when you're looking at the servant and you're looking at this, but you're not really thinking about the practical applications for the servant because, yes, this is really good damage for wave 1, but unless you're going to have some other guy in your 90++ node, say a single target takeout, say maybe the first big guy that's on wave 1, because they are throwing bigger enemies at us on waves 1 and 2 for the 90++ content now, so that's kind of a little bit more real. But unless you're, bringing someone to deal with that, you're not going to have this actual true insane burst damage when going into some of these nodes. Now, what about Muramasa? Muramasa is looking a little bit low here, and let me actually kind of show you how Muramasa works. Now, Muramasa starts off a little bit low, and you're wondering why is his, card buff so low? And that's usually because you want to save, say, this buff right here for when you encounter the really large enemy, because this, like Takeru's third skill, is only 1 turn. You want to pop this whenever you know you're going to be fighting a really large enemy, but generally that's going to be fine because Muramasa starting off really low it doesn't really matter, right? Like, who cares? You know, he has a passive 10% arts buff, he gets 10% on his NP, he gets another 10% NP damage on his NP itself. And usually the first node, it doesn't really matter. You know, those guys are really small. And then if you're going to choose to not use his card buff on, say, the second node, maybe the second node is still doable for him, you're still looking at the range of getting up to a 30% arts buff and then a 20% NP damage buff over here, and he stacks a little bit more. But then the real power and what kind of swings things for Muramasa, if you really want to prefer to use him, is that he's going to be getting on that third, you know, firing of the NP, because he gets, you know, an additional 10% arts from, you know, looping his NP and looping that skill, but then he's also getting 50% of a card buff from his first skill, and then this is stacking again. His damage goes through the roof. Like, this guy, he's doing ridiculous damage. Like, Muramasa at his peak, when he's built up on the third time he fires NP, eclipses what Takeru is able to do when he's got all of his power. But generally, this is being used on turn 1, this is being used on turn 3, and this is what I meant when I was talking about how they kind of just do different things, because there's different applications for both of these servants. If you want to use Muramasa in a fight that you know you can get him to turn 3, or again, say it's more like CQ oriented content, having the Pierce invincibility, the Pierce defense, you can blitz through them and get better as the fight goes on. But say you only need Takeru to take out, you know, one node and a 90++, then you can bring this guy and just have that immediate Muramasa power ready to go. And that's not taking into account his power mods over here. But we'll kind of get back to the normal discussion, show the gameplay in the background again. I just wanted to go more in depth and show you guys what in like a real, like, practical sense these calcs would start to look like. So in regards to looping, I do think you're going to prefer Takeru most of the time. Just, again, split battery, having the higher hits on his NP, and the double power mods that are very common are going to make him a go-to for a lot of people. But if you can get Muramasa built up, he might be a little bit better in those scenarios, especially because he's also stacking NP damage, which means he plays very nicely with Oberon as well. You know, Oberon loves it when you have that high NP damage to increase with his third skill. So it's not like Muramasa's out of a job, which is what I said when they initially came out, because they both function in kind of two different ways. It's just you're probably going to prefer Takeru a little bit more, which, you know, go figure. The unit that comes out 2 years later and kind of a different meta because 90++ nodes are out is going to perform a little bit better in the meta he was made for. You know, go figure. It's not rocket science. But again, that doesn't mean that Muramasa is completely left out to dry. You can still use him if you would like to. Again, I don't think I'm really going to be pulling for Takeru, and I don't think I'm going to be crying that I don't have him in like 3 months unless they make a super specific node that only Takeru can do, and it's like the best raid or the best lotto node we've ever seen in our entire lives. You know, short of that, I think I'm going to be pretty fine with my Muramasa. Especially because when we start shifting over to CQ content, because a lot of people like to pretend that this isn't real. And I'm sorry, but NA players are going to be in a rude awakening when, you know, we start getting advanced quests, when we start getting the Bleached Earth quest, when we start getting more and more CQs and the bosses start to get harder. It's going to be a very rude awakening for a lot of people that just pretend that we don't have any challenging content. We don't have a whole lot of it, but we are getting more of it as the game is going on. And when it comes down to that, both of these guys aren't exactly well tailored for those fights, but I would say that Muramasa is a much better position than, say, Takeru is, because having the insane crit damage, like, can we talk about 100% crit damage for free for 3 turns? And then, God forbid, you try to run away from him because then he gives you another 100% for that turn. And even if you try to run with your invincibility or your evasion, he has Pierce Invul baked into his second skill, his NP has baked in Pierce defense, and he removes all of your offensive buffs, which, again, I know we like removing defensive buffs around here because, you know, that can let you just keep smacking the enemy, but in those more annoying fights where you're going to be forced to be in the fight for longer, being able to remove attack buffs, card buffs, crit chance buffs, NP damage buffs, anything along those lines. I mean, this even includes the enemy getting sure hit or an invul. Being able to remove those off of them to protect your other guys is insanely powerful. It prevents the boss from getting any momentum, and I would argue that is way better than whatever Takeru has. I mean, what? He's stacking defense down on the overcharge effect of his NP, like, big whoop. 30% crit damage? Like, I'm sorry, dude. 30% crit damage is nice. You know, I'll always say, hey, Morgan's 30% crit damage is fine, but dude, it ain't no 100% crit damage. Like, let's keep it a buck. Like, let's not be liars around here. And then sure, Takeru has survivability with the guts. That is nice. But let's also remember these are 2 arts units. Who are you going to pair your arts units with? Castoria, who gives you Invul on the 3rd skill. She debuff cleanses you and gives you the best defensive buff, Solemn Defense Honor NP, or God forbid, you have to only use Lady Avalon, who gives you the AoE Nope skill, the Illusion, and then gives you a better HP stacking buff than Merlin's Heal. I think Muramasa is going to be fine without the guts, right? Not to also mention that you have like Atlas Academy that can give you Invul plus the cooldown reduction. I mean, don't forget you have Mystic Codes and stuff you're able to use as well. Between double Castoria and stuff like Atlas Academy, your Muramasa should be fine. And if your Muramasa's not fine, I'm sorry, that's just a skill issue. You got to learn how to use your skills a little bit better, buddy. So in conclusion, if both of these guys were on rate up at the exact same time, you know, banner A is Takeru, banner B is Muramasa, who would I advise you guys to go ahead and summon for? And as much of a fan of Muramasa I am, and I really want to say that you should go for him, especially because I NP2'd my Muramasa, because, you know, that dude's the GOAT, I would advise most players to go for Takeru just because he's more tailor-made for the current meta. You know, having the split battery is going to be very good in, you know, normal farming nodes that are like 333s, and it's also going to be very good when going into your 90++ nodes where you need to split your battery apart. Having higher NP gain is going to mean in some of those really difficult quests where it's just a 1-1-1 enemy or, you know, a 1-2-1, in those nodes where you really need every little bit of NP gain you can possibly muster, that 8-hit NP is going to be more clutch than Muramasa only having 3 hits, and he might not be able to do some of those nodes. And then the double power mod I think is the nail in the coffin for Muramasa, because having the double power mod that are 2 really strong ones, like I can't really lie and say Divinity and Demonic aren't that good, especially as a combo set. It's very, very strong. And it's really just kind of a boring answer because all Takeru has is kind of like if you just took Muramasa and repackaged his kit a little bit to make it a little bit better for the modern meta, because they do a lot of things that are very similar, but they also don't feel like they step on each other's toes. Because ultimately it comes down to Takeru being the better looper, but if you're going into more difficult content, you're going to bring Muramasa every single time. Because what good is a power mod against a divine opponent going to be if they're just hiding behind an invincibility or a dodge every single other turn? At least Muramasa is making progress. Like, at the very least, he is chipping away at their health and smacking them with big crits because they dared to try to run away from him. But to kind of counter what I was saying earlier, even though we are getting more CQ-oriented content, we are getting more advanced quests, we're getting Bleached Earth quests, we're getting stuff along that line, it still doesn't compare to the amount of farming nodes that we have in the game. Like, even I can't deny that farming is, what, 95% of the game? I mean, even look at most of your main quests. Aside from the boss fights, it's like 90%, you know, 333 random nodes that you're fighting, and then the other 10% is like, alright, you're gonna go fight Comet Saws for a turn, now you're gonna go fight ORT for like 10 battles, and then that's it, right? It's over. And even some of those boss fights, like ORT, can kind of get turned into farming nodes as well. You can kind of just one-turn some of them. So it is a little unfortunate that I do think Muramasa is going to be stronger in more CQ content. It's just we don't have as much of that as we do farming content, and that puts Takeru in a better position. But I'd like to hear what you guys have to say in the comments down below. Ultimately, if they're both on rate up and you chose to go for Muramasa over Takeru, I don't even think that's wrong. I think you're allowed to do that because the difference between them two is just like not big enough for me to care, because ultimately neither one of them are Summer Melusine or Summer Ibuki. So it's just the two of them fighting who's going to be the better A-tier farmer. Meanwhile, Ibuki and Melusine are sitting on the throne of heroes just watching 2 little grown men bicker. Why? I don't know. Do we call Takeru a grown man? I'm not really sure. He's like 5'0", dude. He's really small, but that's just kind of how I see it. It's like, yeah, Takeru's the better looper. Muramasa is going to be better in more CQ weird content, but neither one of them is Ibuki or Melusine, who are way better than both of them combined. Which is why, again, ultimately, if you choose to not summon for Takeru because you have Muramasa, then join the camp that I'm in, because I did a couple of summons for Takeru, and then I decided, you know, it's okay, I have Muramasa. I don't really need to go that hit hard in on the banner, right? Because I already have a guy who is comparable enough that it doesn't really matter. But again, leave a like, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.